Amid the strongmen and murderers who fought the Prohibition gangster wars, only one mob boss built his crime empire on the strength of his word.
A handshake from Meyer Lansky was worth more than the strongest contracts that a battery of lawyers could put together.
Meyer Lansky, the casino king, the quiet godfather, the very image of humility and modesty.
He dressed very well. He never had loud clothes. He said, I don't want to be too flashy.
A shrewd master manipulator who claimed that he never killed a man.
He did business and made his living through men who regularly killed people, and so is equally guilty.
Lansky turned a natural genius for numbers into a multi-million-dollar gambling empire. High rollers made and lost fortunes at his casino tables.
And the $100 bills were that high. Oh, it was just incredible.
Did I enjoy it? Oh, sure, it was profitable, too.
To escape the law, he fled halfway around the world, but it wasn't far enough. Meyer Lansky was born around 1902. His real birth date is not known. His family lived in the Russian town of Grodno, a center of trade on the Polish border with a thriving Jewish community. Little Meyer studied Hebrew and went to this synagogue often with his beloved grandparents. But Jewish life under the Russian Tsars was not easy. As a boy, Meyer witnessed firsthand the brutality of the pogroms, the methodical persecution of the Jews by the Tsar's dreaded Cossack brigades.
When the Jewish community where he lived was suffering particularly, there was a young Jew who stood up and suggested that instead of just lying down, the community should fight back, that young Jewish men should go off to the woods and train and use weapons. And that appealed to Lansky, and all his life he had a chip on his shoulder, and that story was what he produced to rationalize what he became.
Meyer's family decided to flee Russia for the United States in March 1911. The ocean voyage was rough, but tough 9-year-old Meyer was too proud to be seasick in front of his mother. He went out on deck to get sick over the railing. For 2 years, the family lived in an apartment house in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. When Meyer's father could no longer afford the rent, he moved his family to a tenement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. There, more than 500,000 people, mostly Irish, Italians, and Jews, were packed into 2 square miles of crowded city blocks. Meyer got excellent grades in school, but when he wasn't studying, he was out on the streets. He was sucked in right away by the criminal world, and the most seductive part of that world was gambling.
A story Lansky always used to tell was of the night before the Jewish Sabbath in the Lower East Side, when his mother would entrust him with a pot of stew to be taken to the baker's oven, and he was always sent with a nickel to pay the baker for the use of the heat. And on the way, one night, he saw a crap game on the sidewalk, and he was drawn to put down the nickel. And of course, he lost it and had to go back home and tell everybody there'd be no hot stew the next day. And he always described the shame of that moment, but more than the shame, his anger at having been so stupid.
Lansky resolved that he would never be the sucker again. He had discovered that he had a remarkable gift for numbers. He could calculate in his head the odds and the payoffs from games of chance. He started running backroom crap games, taking other suckers' money and stuffing it into his mattress. By the age of 16, he had quit school, and he had a tough enough reputation that older hoods hired him to be what was called a shtarka, Yiddish for enforcer. His principal work was on behalf of local unions, beating up scabs, the men who worked in factories during strikes. But Lansky had greater ambitions than being a small-time hustler, and the ghetto soon offered him 2 partners who would pave the way to the top, Ben Siegel and Charlie Lucky Luciano. He won over Luciano after Lucky and his gang of Italians cornered little Meyer on the street and threatened him. Meyer called their bluff.
The stories he used to tell it was that he said to Luciano, who was the head of this gang, "Go f*** yourself." And suddenly, Luciano was confronted by a weak-seeming little Jewish boy who wouldn't lie down, who wouldn't be pushed around. And that was the beginning of the friendship between Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky.
Lansky met Ben Siegel when he helped the handsome young hoodlum escape from the police after a gang brawl. Together with Ben, known on the street as Bugsy because of his psychopathic rages, Lansky formed his first street outfit, a troupe of Jewish hoods called the Bug and Meyer Gang.
Meyer was the brains, Benny was the brawn. He was the unguided missile, and Meyer was the guidance system, who would use him, cynically often, in later life, for what he wanted to accomplish.
With Siegel as his strongman, Lansky directed the work of the young gang, robberies, extortion, and as always, gambling. When Prohibition began in January 1920, they moved easily into bootlegging, shipping illegal whiskey into the States from Canada and England. But Lansky was still small time. What he needed was a mentor. Then, at a bar mitzvah in 1921, Lansky met the veteran bootlegger and schemer, Arnold the Brain Rothstein. Rothstein was widely regarded as the cleverest gangster in New York. He financed deals and let young hoods like Lansky and his buddies take the risks on the street.
Meyer Lansky worked for him. Lucky Luciano worked for him. Ben Siegel worked for him. Frank Costello worked for him. Legs Diamond worked for him. And I think that was how Lansky made the next step, the next jump.
Rothstein taught Lansky when the bribe was more effective than the bullet, and Lansky expanded his tiny chain of gambling parlors while the cops looked the other way. Then, in November 1928, Arnold the Brain was murdered. Lansky wasn't involved, but the killing allowed Meyer and his pals to go big time.
With the death of Rothstein, they're looking at the Rothstein empire and the viable role they had played in some segments of it, and they can say to themselves, it's now all ours.
It would not be long before Rothstein's students became masters of gangland New York. But it would be Meyer Lansky alone who inherited Rothstein's special mantle. Lansky would become the next great mafia brain. As the Roaring Twenties roared to a close, the New York rackets were firmly under the control of Meyer Lansky and his mob cronies. Every mobster had his specialty. Lansky's was gambling. But to run a high-profit casino, Lansky needed help from communities that would turn a blind eye to illegal betting in exchange for a piece of the action. One such town was Saratoga Springs in upstate New York. In the late 1920s, Lansky's mentor, Arnold Rothstein, had introduced him to Saratoga. By day, rich and poor risked their money downtown at the world-famous racetrack. At night, the betting moved to opulent nightclubs called lake houses, early predecessors of the Las Vegas casinos. Lansky ran the gambling rooms in two of the finest lake houses, the Piping Rock and the Arrowhead Inn. There he fine-tuned the persona that he would use for his entire career: quiet, soft-spoken, and honest.
One thing a real dyed-in-the-wool gambler looks for is a fair gambling operation. And Meyer was always fair. He abhorred bust-out joints. That's where they rigged up roulette tables with battery operation, or phony dice, what they call top or bottom, or slice dice. Meyer would have none of it. He insisted on a fair, honest game, and that's how he built his reputation.
Not to mention a modest fortune. By his late 20s, hundreds of thousands of dollars were passing through Lansky's hands, and like many successful young businessmen, Lansky decided to settle down. In the spring of 1929, Lansky married a beautiful young Jewish woman, Anne Citron. Anne was a friend of Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend, Esther Krakauer. The couples double dated, and when the Lanskys got married on May 9th, Bugsy served as witness. At first, Meyer was happy with domestic life, and Anne was content, shopping along Fifth Avenue for their new home.
But the reality of his life, away at strange hours, not being able to confide in anybody, poisoned his ability to have any sort of decent personal relationship.
The birth of their first child, Buddy, only made the situation worse. Buddy suffered from cerebral palsy and could scarcely use his legs. Anne Lansky blamed her husband.
God punish you for doing the rotten criminal things you're doing, and he visited your sins upon our boy. Okay? Now, whether it's true or not, subconsciously, Meyer had a guilt complex.
Lansky was desperate to cure his son. He read medical journals. He rented an apartment in Boston so Buddy could be treated by a doctor there.
So you have this dichotomy. He's pouring his love and the positive side of his feelings and emotions into trying to make some redemption of his son's life. And then he's criminal.
One of the most powerful criminals in New York City. Unlike other gang leaders, Lansky was learning to avoid the vendettas and police attention brought on by mob violence. Instead, he consolidated his power with his own personal method: fairness.
In the underworld, a handshake from Meyer Lansky was worth more than the strongest contracts that a battery of lawyers could put together, dotting the I's and crossing the T's with the whereases and the therefores. He was a man whose word was good.
He also chose a lifestyle opposite to that of his partners. Ben Siegel was a consummate ladies' man. Lucky Luciano basked in his gangster reputation. But Lansky dressed and lived quietly. He was fastidious in his personal habits. His fedoras were always placed carefully on their hat stands, his pressed shirts on their monogrammed hangers.